This happened to me over 2 decades ago, during my first year in radio at Clear Channel Shreveport in Louisiana. I was in my early 20s working part-time as a board operator and promotions assistant for several stations in our building, as well as doing overnights on the weekends as a disc jockey for the radio station, Rock 99, which is also known as 99X KTUX FM. One of the annual events that our cluster of stations would participate in was the Fortilla at Cross Lake. In the early summer of 2002, our rock station had an on-air sponsorship deal with a local boat dealership, which allowed us to borrow 2 of their boats, a party barge and a motor-powered bass boat, which would be used during this event. It was a near-perfect Saturday to be on the water. The sun was out, and it was also fairly windy. The boats were floating and zooming all over Cross Lake that day. This, combined with the wind, led to there being more wave activity on the lake than usual. Around a half a dozen of us were on the party barge, with at least 2 others riding around on the bass boat. One of the DJ's wives in attendance was wearing a brown straw hat to protect herself from the sun. While the party barge was in the middle of the lake, a gust of wind caught her hat and tossed it into the water. We stopped the barge and attempted to retrieve the hat, but it was too far away for any of us to reach. In the spur of the moment, I made a decision that would nearly result in me becoming a permanent resident of Cross Lake. Without giving it a second thought, I took off my shirt, removed my shoes, and dove into the water without wearing a life jacket. Swimming to the hat was the easy part, but my sense of accomplishment would soon be replaced by absolute fear and helplessness. The barge was only a few feet away from me, and on a calm day, I could have easily swam back to it. But the waves from all the boats on Cross Lake, as well as the wind, prevented me from returning to the barge, no matter how hard I tried. I quickly gave up on retrieving the hat, because now I was fighting just to stay alive. It's a very unique kind of terror when you find yourself thrashing around the open water, knowing that if you stop, you'll die. Everyone on the party barge thought I was messing around at first and were having a good laugh, but it soon became apparent that the waves kept knocking me back despite my best efforts to reach the barge. Our program director, who would eventually become one of my best friends, tried throwing a life preserver toward me, but the wind caught it and it landed out of my reach. The small glimmer of hope I had was snatched away from me. They tried moving the barge closer to me, but it wasn't designed to be maneuvered in that way. Plus, whoever was driving it at the time wasn't exactly an expert. Once it became apparent that I couldn't swim back, I focused all of my remaining energy into kicking in the hopes of keeping my head above water. Fortunately, we did have cell phones back then, and my program director was able to get in touch with the other boat. The only problem was they were on the other side of the lake, which meant I had to stay above water long enough for them to arrive. And at this point, I was running out of time. Those few minutes of kicking just to keep myself from drowning felt like hours, and for the first time, I was truly afraid of dying. I know this sounds crazy, but I could almost feel death's cold embrace. When you're a teenager or a young adult like I was at the time, you feel like your whole life is ahead of you. Chapters of your life yet to be written, never considering the whole book could be slammed shut before the story is even finished. Over a straw hat of all things. The bass boat finally arrived before I lost all the strength in my body. The driver of the boat was another DJ who managed to pull me out of the water. Laying on the floor of that boat, with the sun on my face, was an amazing feeling. I was wet, tired, and my entire body was sore. I had barely survived this ordeal and was now a much wiser man. Nothing makes you feel more grateful to be alive than a near-death experience. Anytime I ever go back into the water, whether it's a lake, river, or the ocean, I always wear a life jacket. On a final note, fate certainly does have a thing for irony. The husband of the woman whose hat I was trying to save was the one who ended up saving me from literally sleeping with the fishes. This is one of the creepiest, unexplained experiences that has ever happened to me. Thinking back on it now, I still get this unnerving feeling that lingers. Anyways, here we go. A group of friends and I, all in our mid-20s, rented out this place on the lake for a fun-filled weekend of drinking and partying. From Friday night to Saturday morning, we pretty much went all out, having a blast on the lake. By the time Saturday afternoon came around, we were all so hungover from the night before, we decided that on this night, there would be no drinking. Maybe a bit of smoking, but that's it. We would just have a chill night and relax. 9 p.m. rolls around. Some of us were inside the lake house, and there was about 5 of us outside. The second floor of the lake house had a deck that overlooked the surrounding forest. You couldn't see the lake from there, but it was within walking distance. I'll mention that we had already had some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town. Mostly just backcountry folk, who I assumed were a bit irritated because a bunch of out-of-towners were coming there looking for a good time. But between the town and the lake was such a large area that realistically, we wouldn't be close enough to anyone to be a bother. Anyways, 3 of the group were on the upstairs deck, my brother being one of them, while I was talking to a friend on a small wooden table just outside the forest. It was a very peaceful night, when suddenly, an unnerving feeling overcame us. It was so distracting that my friend and I stopped talking and just stared into the dark forest. Soon we heard a loud, eerie chanting. I have no idea how far away it was, but it sounded like the chanting was being carried through the forest. All the voices were male. They were loud and perfectly in sync. We were both frozen for at least 20 seconds before I could no longer contain myself and got up and darted toward the house, with my friend following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with the chanting, but it felt almost evil. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second-story deck and joined the others. By the time we got there, the chanting had ceased. "Did you guys hear that?" Before anyone could even respond, the chanting began again. The 5 of us were now peering into the forest, listening to this bizarre chanting. It would sometimes sound very far away, and then relatively close. We couldn't make out what they were saying. It may have been in another language. A loud bang rang out, like someone had hit a huge metal object. What followed that was the scariest part. A man began wailing in extreme pain. All of my hair was now standing up. It was the most vomit-inducing thing I've heard. My brother and I were now staring at each other in a mixture of astonishment and disgust. The wailing stopped, and the chanting began again. After the chanting died down, one of our friends said that it was a bunch of drunk guys in the forest trying to scare us. But there was no way that chanting was coming from a bunch of drunk guys. All the voices were perfectly in sync, and that wail sounded like someone was being tortured. Plus there was all that tension we felt. Something extremely messed up was taking place somewhere in that forest. It definitely wasn't in our immediate proximity, but close enough to where we could hear it perfectly. I remember that one of our group suggesting that we go explore and find out what was going on, but obviously, the rest of us thought that was a very stupid idea. I regret to say that we didn't call the cops. Looking back, I wish we would have, but the forest around that lake was so massive, it could have been from anywhere. I was very relieved, to say the least, when we were driving out of there the next morning. Thinking back to that night, it still gives me the worst kind of feeling. Whatever was going on, it just felt so wrong and evil. So this story is going to be pretty deep, and it will sound unbelievable, but I will provide some articles to corroborate everything. It all began in the summer of 2021. I was working as a lifeguard at a small beach called Adams Point Beach, located off Quincy Lake, New York. I didn't really enjoy my job a whole lot, to be honest. It was just a way of making ends meet. But I did make friends with some of the other lifeguards, so I guess that was a plus. To make matters even more difficult, I lived in a house off the lake with my parents, who would fight with each other almost every night. It was a very toxic environment to be in, and at one point I was working 2 jobs just to stay away from that place. A year after being hired, my boss had demoted me to a sub-lifeguard. He gave me some bullshit reason for doing this, but it pissed me off because I could no longer work with my friends. Fast forward to August of 2022. I was called in to cover for another lifeguard who had to call out. Usually there were 3 lifeguards working this shift, but on that day, there was a staff shortage. The shift began as normal. I would spend 30 minutes in the lifeguard chair before being swapped out. About 10 minutes later, while I was on my phone in a rec room, I heard a bunch of commotion coming from outside. There was screaming. I didn't know what was going on, so I rushed outside. What I saw is something I'll never be able to unsee. The lifeguard, along with 4 other people, had a woman on a rescue board. One of her legs was horribly wounded. I mean, it was nearly gone. I almost vomited at the sight, but I had to help out the other lifeguard. It was my job. I helped carry the board, but I had to keep my head turned, as it was too brutal to look at directly. I helped place the board on a table next to a shed. Thankfully, the police had already been called and arrived shortly after. The woman ended up being airlifted to the hospital by helicopter. During the aftermath, I asked one of the beachgoers what happened, and he said, "There was someone in a speedboat that wasn't looking where he was driving. People told him to slow down, but he didn't listen. After he ran over that poor woman, he stopped his boat, and then he just took off again." I could not believe what I was hearing. I then asked the man to describe what the boat looked like, because I pretty much know who comes out to this lake and who lives around here. He said it was one of those blue jet boats. When he told me this, I felt as if my entire world was coming to an end. There was only one person that I knew who owned that kind of boat. My own father. Everything went blurry, and then it all went black. I woke up to 2 people beside me, asking me if I was alright. "Yeah, I'm fine. I've just never seen somebody's leg like that. Excuse me, I just need to go get a drink of water." My boss arrived a short time later and told everyone to go home because of what happened. I got my car and made the 5-minute drive back to my place. When I got there, I saw my dad pacing back and forth nervously through the kitchen window. It did cross my mind to turn him in, but I was just so scatterbrained in the moment that I rushed inside the house and went into a full rampage on him. "You hit that poor woman on the lake, and just ran away? You fucking coward." He couldn't even look at me as I yelled at him. My adrenaline was now going into hyperdrive. I just couldn't contain myself, so I shoved him and then started hitting him. After hitting him about 10 times, I had finally pushed him to his limits, and he hit me so hard I fell to the ground and my ears were ringing. "I don't care what I did. You do not put your hands on me, ever. Now stay down." He then ran out of the house and took off somewhere. I sat there bawling my eyes out. As I alluded to at the beginning of this story, I didn't have the best relationship with my father, but this was a whole new low for him. We weren't close, but never in a million years would I have thought he would end up doing something like this. Now, I don't know all the details, but no criminal charges were ever filed against him. I'm not sure how he weaseled out of it, but there was never an arrest, a trial, or a media circus. If I had to guess, it was ruled an accident, and the woman and my father came to some kind of civil agreement. I remember my mom coming back from the hospital one day. She went to go check on that woman and told me that she was alive and well, but that her damaged leg had to be amputated. I felt so relieved that she survived, but I was also devastated that my own father was responsible for this. We never saw him again after that night. He not only fled the scene of the accident, but he also abandoned his marriage as well. It goes without saying that there was a lot of other things that were going on that I'm not willing to get into, but the boating accident was the straw that broke the camel's back. I quit my job as a lifeguard shortly after this incident. It was causing me a lot of trauma. I even began having nightmares over it. It got so bad that I had to go see a psychologist at least 3 times a week. Each day I'm slowly getting better and better, and I still have a long way to go. I wish I could tell you the story ends here. However, what happened at the lake and my father leaving us aren't the only reasons I'm in therapy. Let's move the timeline to mid-July of this year. I am still living with my mom out on Quincy Lake. My dad has been gone for some time now, and we were moving on with our lives. I needed some time to myself that day, and I decided to go kayaking around 7 p.m. I paddled to a shallow area of the lake. I planned on stopping at the beach area for a while to give my arms a rest before heading back. While approaching the beachhead, I kept looking at the water just beneath my kayak. Something was off. It was getting dark out by this point. I had a mounted light on the kayak, but since I knew the way by heart, I didn't want to waste the battery on it just yet. My paddle then hit something in the water. At first, I thought it was a rock, which I thought was very strange, because I knew this area of the lake very well, and I wasn't anywhere near where the rocks usually were. So I pulled out my flashlight, turned it on, and looked. I shit you not, I saw the body of an old woman floating in the water. I let out the most ear-piercing shriek you've ever heard in your life. I quickly paddled out of there, reaching the shore a short time later. After pulling my kayak to shore, I ran to the grass area and threw up about 5 times. Luckily, I had my cell phone on me, so I immediately called 911. About 7 cop cars showed up 10 minutes later. The body was of a 71-year-old woman from New Lebanon. They estimated that she had been out there for about 4 hours before I discovered her. In the news reports that I've read, the articles state that a lifeguard discovered her body. I never spoke to a reporter after giving my statement to the police, but I assume they're referring to me. But I was no longer a lifeguard at that point. It's been a rough few years for me. I was hoping after the pandemic our family could turn things around, but between the boating accident, my father leaving, and the dead woman in the lake, I'd say things aren't going too well. My mother and I still live in the same house on Quincy Lake, but I'm hoping that someday the both of us can move on and leave all these horrible memories behind. This story happened to me in 2008, and I didn't really talk about it back then as it scared the crap out of me. But this happened a while ago, and it's a very well-known creepy story among my inner circle, so I think I may as well share it here. At the time, I was living with my parents and sister in Brisbane, Australia. I was 19 back then. I remember my dad had just gotten Foxtel, cable television in Australia, but only the TV in the lounge room could use the cable box. But I really wanted to watch cable in my room without paying for a new box. So my dad went out and bought an AV transmitter receiver, which is basically a two-piece bit of hardware where you would plug this tiny box into the cable television and it would transmit a video signal to the receiver, which was connected to the TV in my room. So one Saturday, I decided to connect it. This is a picture I took of the setup. My younger sister, who was 16 at the time, was the only other person home, upstairs in her room. My room was downstairs. I opened the box and connected it. At first, it was going back and forth, trying to get the channel and cables right, etc. I didn't have any luck at first. I remember just sitting there, and something started fuzzing in. This is where things start to feel like a horror film. I remember thinking, oh, here we go, and waiting to see the picture focus in. As it started fuzzing in, I remembered that I didn't even turn on the cable box in the lounge, and that's why it wasn't working this whole time. But then why was I still getting a signal? It seemed to hit me all at once, as I realized the cable box was off, and the picture fuzzed in. I saw an image of a bed. I freaked out, as at first I thought it was my bed. At the time, I had recently seen Saw 3, and I remember that scene where a character turns on the television, and it's a camera filming her in her own apartment. That was the first thing I thought of. I sprinted upstairs to my sister, absolutely terrified. I told her to come down and take a look. She came down, and we both realized it wasn't my bed. We didn't know whose bed it was. Obviously, it was the AV receiver picking up a camera signal, but we were still so confused as to who or what it was for. Eventually, my parents came home, and we concluded it would have been a neighbor or someone living close by for us to be picking up that signal. We left the television on and waited until around 6 p.m. Then someone came into the room. My dad recognized him as our next-door neighbor. We still didn't know what this camera was for, but we assumed it had something to do with infidelity. It was either him or his wife that set it up to watch the other to see if they were cheating. We entertained the idea that he was some kind of serial killer and would film himself murdering people in his room, but that was just to freak each other out. We would often make jokes about how one night we would turn this on and it would just be his face with clown makeup, staring into the camera and waving, before exiting the bedroom with a knife in his hand. This never happened, but what did happen was still very unnerving. We connected to his signal for over a week. We felt a bit weird watching it, but after a few days the novelty kind of wore off, and we're satisfied with the explanation that it was to catch his wife cheating. It was around this time they were having some work done to the house. During the weekdays they would be out, and there would be contractors at their house for pretty much the whole day. It had been like this for over a month. During this time we turned it on, and we started watching the feed, and saw a man walk into the room. It was a plumber that had been there many times for the renovations. We didn't think anything of it until he started opening up the drawers. I called out to my mom, the only other person who was home at the time, and we started watching it. He started getting the wife's underpants and smelling them, doing all kinds of creepy shit. At first we were like, Oh my god, how embarrassing. Will the neighbors see this somehow? But what happened next was truly terrifying. He slowly made his way over to the camera and looked right down the lens. We were convinced he knew we were watching. My mom immediately called my dad. I kept watching. He started fiddling with it and then put it back down. I told my mom that I didn't think he knew we were watching, but he was definitely the one who put that camera there. Eventually my dad came home, and by that time, the plumber was gone. Much to my mom's pleading, my dad went over to the neighbors to tell them what we saw. Mom wanted to completely stay out of it and was terrified, understandably. When he told the neighbors, they had no idea what we were talking about. They allowed my dad to go up to their room and discovered that what was holding the camera was a device in the wall that was designed to monitor water usage, which was completely normal. At the time, Brisbane was going through a drought, and there was lots of water restrictions. The plumber had installed this into the wall, but positioned a camera behind it to watch the bed. Immediately they called the police, who came over and conducted an investigation. For the next week or so, we didn't hear much about it. I spent most of this time just telling my friends about it and showing them pictures. But to be honest, my whole family was scared every night. It was just very creepy thinking that we could have had stuff like that hidden in our house. Chances are we didn't, but it was unsettling regardless. After a couple of weeks, my mom was talking to the wife next door and asked what ended up happening. The wife said that the police discovered, at nights, he would come to our street and sit in his car, which had tinted windows, and would watch them from his laptop. When my mom told me this, I got the shivers. Aside from the natural creepiness of someone sitting in their car, watching our neighbors on a hidden camera feed, I also remembered on multiple nights when I came back home late from my girlfriends or walked home after a night out. I always remember seeing a station wagon parked down the street from our house. It was never there during the day. Always at night, I would walk past it and see my reflection in the windows, assuming that nobody was inside. I was also confused by whose car it was, but I never thought anything nefarious was going on. But it still freaks me out thinking that this creepy plumber was sitting in there, spying on my neighbors, and doing God knows what. At the time, I found this all extremely disturbing, but it happened so long ago that me and my friends have a good laugh about it now. This story happened a very long time ago, and a lot of it I struggled to remember, so I had to get a lot of details from my mom before I wrote this. About 11 years ago, when I was 8 years old, my family and I, mom, dad, and my brother, as well as my brother's girlfriend who was living with us at the time, went on a holiday to Australia to visit some relatives on my mom's side of the family. They lived in a very rural part of Victoria. When facing the house on the left side, there were 2 wide open fields, and then at the far end of these fields was a heavily forested area with a dirt track running through it. My grandparents, the ones that lived here, would often go on hikes through the forest to see the wildlife. My mother, being a dedicated bird watcher, decided to head off into the forest with me and Lisa, my brother's girlfriend, as we both had a fascination with wildlife. We must have been walking on that dirt trail for around 10 minutes, taking pictures of the various animals we came across. We passed by a line of motorbikes and saw about 7 bikers having a barbecue. One of the bikers politely smiled at my mother, and she responded with a simple, "Good evening." As we made our way past the group, one of the bikers approached us and asked where we were going. After we told him, he informed us that they had been camping in this area for around 2 nights and warned us to be careful, as people had been having a shooting game in the forest. These people apparently also had aggressive dogs with them, so we were told to tread cautiously. About 15 minutes later, I spotted an old barn. which I dashed off to explore, being the adventurous child I was. Lisa and my mother were busy observing some kind of bird, and I didn't tell them where I was going. As I approached this barn, I saw 3 large dogs tied up outside. They were Rottweilers, and they seemed incredibly aggressive. They were on chains and were barking and snarling. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I assumed they were there for hunting. But looking back, Rottweilers aren't really hunting dogs. There was also an old mattress on the floor outside, which appeared to be covered in brown stains, and a foul smell emanated from it. I was around 3 feet away from the mattress, but the stench was unbelievably powerful. At this point, I changed my mind and was going to turn around when I saw someone emerging from the barn. The image of this man is one of the very few things I remember clearly to this day. He was very tall, around 6'4". The strangest thing about him, though, was that he was wearing a blue pinstriped suit and one of those large top hats. His clothes seemed very worn, and his face, the parts of it that weren't covered by a large beard, looked red, as if he had just got done working out in the hot sun all day. I remembered the man smiled as he approached me. I asked him if he was a magician, and he said, "Nah, mate, I just look after the doggies. Do you like doggies?" This is where things start to get weird. He began to get closer and asked me if I wanted to come inside and have my picture taken with the dogs. I politely declined and said that my mom would be looking for me. He grabbed my arm lightly and said that it would only be a second. At that point, I heard my mom shouting, demanding to know what he was doing. The man simply let go of me and just stared at her. She asked him again what he was doing, in which he continued just to blankly stare. He didn't say a word. My mom immediately grabbed my arm, and we made our way back to the trail as quickly as possible. We got about halfway there when I turned around and told my mom that the magician was following us. She turned around, and sure enough, he was power walking right behind us. My mom screamed at him and asked what the hell he was doing. Again, he didn't reply. He simply continued walking toward us. At that point, my mom began walking even faster, to the point where she was actually dragging me along. The next part of the story is mostly a blur to me. I remember my mom gasping, picking me up, and sprinting at full speed while screaming for help. My mom told me that the man had begun running toward us and managed to grab my leg. She said that Lisa jumped on the man's back and began scratching his face before he threw her off. While distracted, my mom took the opportunity to kick the man in the balls, got Lisa off the ground, and they took off down the trail with me over her shoulder. I remember that we slowed down shortly after and stopped briefly to catch our breath. We continued walking, but the magician would eventually show up again from a brush area. My mom began to panic, and we all started running again. The man was sprinting after us. As we were approaching the area the bikers were camping at, my mom was screaming for help. 2 bikers emerged from the trees nearby. Once we saw them, my mom shouted, "That man tried to kidnap my son." The magician then stopped, turned around, and immediately bolted in the other direction. One of the bikers pursued him, but unfortunately, the magician got away. I remembered that the bikers were incredibly nice, and I soon forgot about the strange man with the top hat after one of the bikers let me sit on his motorcycle while my mom and Lisa sat in a sidecar. They took us to the nearest town and dropped us off at the police station, where my mom filed a report. After that, one of the bikers gave us a lift back to my grandparents' place, which was really nice of him. I never got to thank him at the time, as I didn't fully comprehend the seriousness of the situation, but on the off chance that he's hearing this, I just want to say thank you. A bit of background. This encounter takes place several years ago in a remote area of the Australian outback. I'm a pretty built 6'2" guy, and I was around 26 years old at the time. Now, let's get into the story. I was on a road trip with a friend, traveling around the central Queensland outback in my old, semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both science zoology nerds, and we heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is basically a grouping of 3 areas: Winton, Richmond, and Hughenden. Dinosaur bones have been found in these places before, as well as dinosaur tracks with preserved foot imprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple of days, and we were pretty keen to check out this trail. So we made the decision to do a 6-hour round trip in a single day. We were pretty ambitious and stupid. We left at 9 a.m. the next morning, packed up our car with lunch, several liters of water, and my trusty GPS, and then we set out. It was a long drive, and halfway through my AC decided to give out, and if any of you have lived in or have visited Australia during the summer, you know how brutally hot it can be. So I'm sure you can imagine the 3-hour trip there without air conditioning, with the eventuality of another 3-hour trip back, was going to be hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working, as the map software didn't recognize the area that we were in. Luckily, I had some old maps in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to go back to map reading when you're used to a computer screen telling you where to go, especially given that we're talking about the Australian outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we make it to the trail and kick around for a couple of hours. I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty awesome. We then decided to make the trip back, as it was starting to get later in the afternoon, and we didn't want to be driving back in the dark. As we were about to leave, this older man, who appeared to be an employee of the trail company, dressed in all khaki and camouflage gear, stopped and asked us where we had come from and where we were heading. He gave me the stink eye when I was vague with the details, but my friend told him the name of the town that we were staying in. He seemed to take a real liking to my friend, and he laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey. Apparently we had taken the long way, and there was a much quicker route to get back, and it would shave an hour off our trip. We jumped at the directions. Ain't nobody got time for an extra hour in a car with no AC. We wrote everything down and went on our merry way, thinking about how lucky we were to have met that old man who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut. But I'm not going to lie, there was definitely a creepy vibe coming off of him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in an area I had never been in, which eventually led us to a straight, narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection after about a half hour, take a right, and continue down that road until we got back to the main highway. After an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail, we hadn't reached this intersection. I was starting to freak out a little bit, thinking that we had missed a turn, but my friend was completely chilled out and was sure that we would get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slowly, but there are kangaroos out here, and things can get very dangerous if you hit one. We had been traveling for a while now, and it was getting later and later. It got to the point where our gas tank was only about a quarter full. There were no houses out here, no other roads or cars in sight, and I really was not comfortable with where this was heading. We were in the middle of nowhere, in a remote area of the Australian outback. There weren't even any trees, only this dirt road and dry bushland shrubs as far as the eye could see. I stopped the car and told my friend to get out the binoculars to take a look around to see if we could spot a landmark. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car, and I still do. He obliges me and could make out a house-like structure not too far off in the distance, so we made the decision to head for that. It was the only thing around. We figured it could probably be a house, and maybe the people there would be kind enough to give us some gas to top us off and some better directions out of this place. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that it wasn't a house at all. We pulled up out front and saw that it was an old caravan that has been burned down to a shell from the inside out. There were still 3 blackened partial walls up, so we couldn't see all the way in. It looked as though someone had been there recently, because there were animal bones strung up all over the place, and a cow skull at the entrance. Some of the bones even had grass or horsehair still woven to them, and they were arranged like decorations. We then saw this hand-painted sign that had been staked into the ground, with the words, "Moonlight Motel," written on it. My alarm bells are now ringing loud and clear. I nudge my friend and say, "Let's get the hell out of here." But he was distracted by something in the distance. It was a car coming from the direction we just came from. It would have been only about 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were heading out this way, but we never saw it once. It was kicking up a ton of dust, which indicated that it was coming toward us pretty fast. It was at this point that we both hear this creepy, scratching sound coming from the caravan, like somebody was scratching at the wall from inside. I moved a bit closer to try and see what it was. I then saw somebody peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then, this childlike voice, that was obviously a man doing his best to imitate a girl, said, "Are you here to play with me?" My friend and I just look at each other, and then booked it out of there. We head back to the inner sanctum of my X-Trail, and just as I'm about to reverse, that other car stops just behind mine, with the high beams on. I couldn't see the driver, but now they prevented me from reversing out of there. I had no choice but to drive forward and turn around, narrowly missing the staked motel sign. As we were turning to leave, the driver starts blaring the horn. I sped past them, back in the direction we came from, and thankfully, the other car didn't follow. It was nearing twilight at this point, and it was very dangerous to be out on these country roads once it's dark because of the aforementioned kangaroo situation. But we were feeling a bit better as we managed to navigate our way back to where we came from and eventually reached the dino trail. We even started to joke around about what happened. The other person in the car was probably just honking at us to get our attention, wanting help with directions or something. I pull into the parking lot and go to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours and explain that we had almost gotten lost on our way back to the town we were staying at, and the lady was kind enough to give us just enough gas to make it back. I couldn't help myself, and I mentioned to her that her co-worker was a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. She asked me to describe the man, and after I did, she gives me this strange look and says, "That man does not work here. I saw him talking with a tourist today, and my boss had to ask him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where people were staying and telling them that he had vacancies at his place and that they could stay there for the night. It was called the Moonlight Motel." I was 7 years old when my family went on holiday to Gran Canaria. During this holiday, we visited a rather large water park just outside of the Puerto Rico. Not referring to the Caribbean island, it's the name of a holiday resort situated on the southwest coast of the Gran Canaria island. The water park was massive, 4 sections with about 5 slides per area, so everyone seemed to be having fun. But I was very young at the time and mainly kept to the smaller kid slides and the shallow wave pools, sometimes venturing to the medium slides with my father. But after a while, my parents wanted to go on the biggest slides the park had to offer, and they left me and my younger brother in the care of my uncle, who was with my cousin in the kids' pool. I tell him that I'm going to the medium slides again, which were within viewing distance from where he was. He allowed it, and off I went. After a while, I headed back to the kids' pool, to where our loungers were, to check up with my uncle and to see if my parents had returned yet. But when I got back, I couldn't find anyone. Me being only 7 at the time, I began to panic a little bit, while going off in the direction of the big slides to find my parents. After a while of walking about, probably looking very distressed, a chubby Englishman comes up to me. I'm Scottish, so I can tell, and he asked me if I was alright. He seemed nice at first, and offered to help me look for my parents. But I knew all about stranger danger, and I wasn't allowed to talk to him, so I just walked off, still looking for my parents. A few minutes later, I see the man again. In hindsight, he was probably following me. He approaches me again and offers to get me some popcorn and a drink while I waited for my parents, to which again I say no, as my mother told me to never accept anything from strangers under any circumstances. At this point, I see a lifeguard, and I walk over to him for help. After speaking with him and telling him that I had to find my parents, the man appears again and begins telling the lifeguard that he was a family friend and that he would take me back to where we were. The lifeguard could tell by the look on my face that this man was lying, and then asks, "Do you know this guy?" To which I tell him no. The lifeguard then offers to walk me back to where I had last seen my family, which I obviously take him up on, as by now, I'm a bit creeped out. We eventually find my parents by the sunbeds. I could tell that my mother was very upset. The lifeguard explained to my parents what happened, and that he'll keep a lookout for that guy so he doesn't bother me again. I don't remember much after this. Years later, when I was old enough to understand, my mom told me why she was so upset when they didn't know where I was, other than the obvious concern that her son was gone. Earlier that year in Portugal, there was a disappearance of a girl that really hit the UK hard. I'm sure most of you know what I'm referring to. Many people were afraid of going abroad on holiday. Looking back, I sometimes think about how I could have been the second kid to go missing that year. When 2 of my friends and I were juniors in college back in 2018, we decided to sneak into a place called Playland Park in Rye, New York. One of my friends grew up in Rye and had done this many times before, so while I was a bit nervous about getting arrested for trespassing, I felt a bit reassured that the park wasn't very well monitored at night. It was around 1 a.m. when we drove and parked our car next to a large fence and attempted to scale it. It was rather difficult and required us to step onto each other's hands to get over, which gave me intense anxiety about how the 3 of us were going to get back over the fence on the way out. After both of my friends got over the fence, I attempted to chicken out and just wait in the car. But after a bit of peer pressure, I caved in, and after several minutes of struggling, I managed to make it over the fence on my own, and we began walking while lighting up a joint. It was pitch black at this point, and almost all the lights in the park were off. We approached the water flume ride, which went up about 100 to 150 feet and then dropped into a steep slope. Along the side of the ride was a staircase for technicians and employees, which my friends decided to climb for a better view. At this point, I chickened out and decided to stay at the bottom out of a fear of heights. As they climbed the stairs, I looked out across the park and noticed something very strange. We weren't alone. Several hundred feet from us was a pond with what appeared to be a small boat or raft inside and about 4 or so people riding it with flashlights attached to their heads. What was even stranger was the fact that there were 2 dark figures swimming in the pond, looking for something beneath the water. I could barely make out the silhouettes of these figures, but after a few minutes I noticed that they could see us and began mobilizing the boat in our direction. I frantically started to whisper scream to my friends, who were now all the way at the top of the water ride and could barely hear me. At this point, the boat had reached land, and the small lights on their helmets were now heading in our direction, fast. My friends finally raced down the stairs, and we began sprinting as fast as we could down the boardwalk that was dimly lit, then back toward the way we came. As we sprinted down the long, straight boardwalk, I realized that we were completely visible now, and began to accept the reality that we might be caught and arrested. We rounded the corner, got back to the fence, and climbed over safely, hopping into our car and dipping out immediately. I couldn't believe that we weren't caught, as the figures who were chasing after us were no more than a few hundred feet away when they initially spotted us. To this day, I still wonder why the hell there were people swimming around in a pond at an amusement park at 1:30 in the morning. My friend told me that kids had drowned in that pond before, making me wonder if they were searching for a body. I googled any articles I could find, but to no avail. My friends and I are still totally puzzled by this experience and can't really come to a logical explanation. Just thinking about it now still gives me the chills. This happened in the summer of 2008, toward the end of my 8th grade year. My parents started me in school a bit early, so by this time I was 13 years old. As a side note, I wouldn't hit puberty until I was well into high school, so I was one of the smallest out of my classmates. The point is, there was no way anyone could have mistaken me for an adult. The 8th grade trip this year was to visit the nearest amusement park, Six Flags Great America. For the first part of the visit, I was in a group of about 6 students. Several rides later, my group wanted to stop to go get something to eat and just relax and chill out for a while. But since this was the first year that I came here where I was actually tall enough to ride the roller coasters, that was the only thing that I was interested in doing. So myself and my friend Kevin branched off from the group so we could just ride the roller coasters for the rest of the visit. We got in a few rides before getting in line for the Raging Bull for a second time. By this time, it was getting late, and the lines were long, but there was still enough time for a couple more rides. Unfortunately, I hadn't considered how big of an issue my motion sickness was going to be. Whenever I got off a roller coaster, I would have this feeling of vertigo that only got worse with each ride I would take. At first, it would begin to go away after a few minutes, and would be completely gone by the time I was boarding the next coaster. But each time it would take longer and longer to go away. So we were in line for the Raging Bull again, and I was already starting to feel nauseous even before getting on. I still didn't want to chicken out, so I got on anyway, hoping that any of my nausea would go away as it had earlier. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The moment I stepped off, my world was spinning, and I had the worst nausea-induced headache combination I've ever felt in my life. In contrast, Kevin said that he would get back in line and ride the Raging Bull one last time before Six Flags closed. At that time, there was only 15 minutes before closing. This time, however, I told Kevin that there was no way I was riding again. I told him that he could go on, and that I would be waiting for him outside the ride. He said he didn't want to ride alone, but saw that I wasn't going to change my mind. So he got in line while I waited at the bench right outside the entrance. In retrospect, I should have tried waiting in line with him instead of splitting up, but I truly felt that I couldn't stand without falling over, so I sat on the bench, and he would be taking his last ride without me. 10 minutes passed while I was sitting on this bench, trying to recuperate. My eyes were closed and I was trying to relax. so I could only hear the people and music around me. It was then that I realized someone was saying,
"Hello?"
over and over again. Once I became aware of it, I realized that I had been hearing it for a while and had just been tuning it out with every other noise I was hearing. My next thought was, I wish whoever that person is calling would answer already. Until I realized that there wasn't anyone around except for myself and the person calling. Finally, it occurred to me that the person was calling to me. I turned and saw a woman who I had never seen before standing in the Raging Bull line. She looked like a perfectly normal woman in her 30s and had a friendly smile on her face. Back then, I was always very polite and even a people pleaser to a certain extent. Despite how horrible I was feeling, the first thing I did was apologize for not answering sooner, telling her that I didn't know that she was calling out to me.
"Don't worry about it, sweetheart. What's your name?"
I told her my first name without giving it much thought. She then said,
"Wow, that's a lovely name."
which I thought was odd, because I have a very ordinary and boring name. She did not tell me hers, though I wouldn't get a chance to ask, because right away she asked me if I wanted to ride on the Raging Bull with her. I simply and politely told her that I didn't, and hoped that she would leave it at that, as I was still feeling miserable.
"You should come with me."
I can't. I'm not feeling well. That's why I'm here waiting for my friend.
"Oh, come on, you'll be fine."
She insisted. Sorry, I really shouldn't. I'll probably puke on the ride. She basically ignored what I said, all the while still smiling.
"Oh, don't worry about it. Just come on already."
At this point, her tone was still playful. Sorry, I'm waiting for my friend. He'll be back soon. If I get on, he won't know where I am.
"He can wait for you here. Don't worry, it's no big deal. It'll make you feel better."
I told her that Kevin wouldn't stick around here because he might have assumed that I had gone back to the bus or to the bathroom. Not even paying attention to my concerns, she just said again,
"I said it will be fine. Now come on."
Finally, I was beginning to think that this was weird. Why was this random woman so adamant about me going on this ride with her? I couldn't understand it. Since nothing I said had persuaded her to leave me alone, I just reminded her that Six Flags was closing anyway, so there was no point. By now, there must have been less than 5 minutes until closing time. I knew that by the time we got to the ride, they wouldn't be letting anyone on. That's when she said,
"I work here, so it's fine."
I didn't see what that had to do with anything. Could employees ride after closing? I don't know. But I did notice that she wasn't wearing any kind of uniform to identify her as an employee. She was just wearing regular street clothes. She must have noticed how I was looking at her, because she quickly changed her story.
"Okay, I don't work here, but I do have a lot of friends that work here."
Again, I didn't see what this had to do with anything. Would her and I be able to ride after closing just because she had some friends who worked there? And why did she even mention that she worked there when she really didn't? Something fishy was going on here. I then asked, why don't you just ride with your friends? Because I was still very confused as to why she was asking me when she apparently had a lot of friends around who would be off of work soon. Her smile widened.
"Well, you're special, and I want to go with you."
That just made me feel more confused and uncomfortable. I kept trying to explain why I didn't want to get on, repeating my reasons again, trying to be as polite as possible, because I didn't like rejecting people or hurting their feelings. I was still hoping that she would just take no for an answer and leave me alone. She continued to ignore my protests and just kept asking me to go with her, saying that it was no big deal and that she didn't want to go with anyone but me. After a while, she finally said,
"Is that your friend?"
It was to my relief that I saw Kevin coming out of the exit. I headed toward him quickly, but then stopped and turned to wave goodbye to the woman. It still seemed rude to me just to walk away from someone who had been talking to me for several minutes, even if she was being annoying. When I turned to her and saw her face, it was the first time that I genuinely felt afraid during this encounter. This entire time she had been smiling, acting very nice and friendly, but now she was staring at me completely infuriated, almost enraged. I was the kind of kid who never liked upsetting people or getting into trouble, so I had never seen anyone look at me like that before. It was a look of pure hatred on her face that made me feel like if I had been any closer to her, she might have attacked me. I was so anxious about it that I went over to Kevin before he reached me and left with him quickly, because I was worried that she would leave the line and chase after us. Thank God she didn't. But also, I feel like she was a bit too smart to attack me in public. The thing is, the line leading up to the Raging Bull was very long, and most of it was hidden from outside view. Since it was approaching closing time, the line would have been mostly deserted, so if I had gone with her, it would have been just me and her, completely isolated. The only people I told were my parents. Once I explained the situation, my mom said that if I had gone with her, I wouldn't have made it to the ride. It wasn't until my mom said this that it finally dawned on me. The woman was not actually interested in riding the roller coaster at all. My dad gave me another speech about how I was never supposed to go anywhere alone with someone I didn't know well, and that in public I should always travel with someone else. He pointed out that even if I was with another kid, it was still dangerous. My parents did tell me that they were glad that I had the sense enough not to go anywhere with her. My main thought about the matter, back then and even now, is that the reason I didn't go was just because I was sick, and I didn't want to inconvenience my friend or teachers by getting on the ride so close to closing time without them knowing where I was. I didn't not go because I was suspicious of her. It's scary to think of how trusting I was of this woman, right up until I saw how murderous she looked when she saw that she had lost. Over the years, my mind went back and forth between assuming that she was some kind of predator and giving her the benefit of the doubt. Especially when I was younger, I really wanted to believe that maybe she truly did just want to go on the Raging Bull with me. But being an adult now, I can't give her the benefit of the doubt anymore. What wholesome explanation is there for a 30-plus-year-old adult asking some prepubescent child sitting by themselves to go anywhere with them, alone? A little background. My brother and I were both 10 at the time, and we were taking swimming lessons at a public pool about 10 minutes away from our house. We would go for our lesson every Friday evening, and afterwards we would usually just chill in the spa pool until my dad was ready to go. On one particular Friday night, my brother and I were in the spa pool doing kid stuff and whatnot, when I noticed a man sitting directly across from the spa, just kind of staring at me. The man was very tall and thin, and he had a very pointed nose and button-like eyes. He had a very short, thin gray hair, and his skin was unusually red. I didn't think much of this at the time, as I had seen this man around the pool before. I also think my dad may have had a conversation with him at one point. Nevertheless, his stare was off-putting, and it made me feel so uncomfortable that I had to get out of the spa and sit outside waiting for my dad. After that, I began seeing him everywhere. Wherever I was, he was there. The grocery store, the mall, outside of my school, and always at my Friday night swimming lessons. I never told my dad about seeing him. I thought maybe I was overreacting and was very naive to the obvious danger. I remember one instance where I was in a department store with my mom and saw him standing at the end of every aisle we went down. Red flags started going off, when I saw him carrying a camera around with him. He would always be dressed in a completely black outfit, with his camera bag around his neck. One day I was at the mall with a couple of my friends, when one of them pointed him out before I had even noticed him. I told them about what was happening and the way he would always look at me. My friend's older sister advised me to tell security so that he could be removed. I did just that, and as soon as he saw them coming, he got up and left. Fast forward about 2 years or so. I hadn't seen my stalker friend for a long time now, and it was becoming a distant memory at this point, until I got called into the school office because my uncle was here to come pick me up early. I was confused, but I thought this was a last-minute kind of thing. As I was approaching the office, I saw him there, arms open, waiting for me. I felt sick. I had forgotten all about this man, and 2 years later, he has the nerve to come and try to get me out of school? I marched right past him and directly to the receptionist and simply said, "This man is not my uncle." I then walked back to class. My school would sometimes have lunch outside, and whenever we did, I would see him standing somewhere nearby. He would wave at me and try to beckon me over, holding up a chocolate bar as some kind of bait. So these random appearances at my school continued, to the point where my school had to contact my parents and let them know about the situation. My dad was very distraught and demanded the police be contacted so that we could get a restraining order. That's when we found out something truly sickening about this man. It turns out he was a convicted sex offender. The police took his camera and found hundreds and hundreds of photos of me, some of which were zoomed into my bedroom windows. He was arrested, and we got the restraining order against him. And thankfully, I haven't seen him since. This happened about 12 years ago. I'm a former football player, and I'm a pretty big guy. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I lived in a nice neighborhood in Arizona. Needless to say, I didn't have much to worry about at night. I had 2 roommates living with me at the time, so there always seemed to be someone home with me at night. I got home from a late business trip around midnight, came into the house exhausted, and dropped everything and went straight to bed. I'm a heavy sleeper, so it takes something pretty loud to wake me up. Around 3 a.m., I hear a loud knocking on my door. It sounded like someone was trying to kick my door down. I had never heard anything like it before, though it was a Saturday, so I figured my roommates had gone out to the bars and forgotten their keys. Begrudgingly, I stumble out of bed, walk down the hallway in the dark, and noticed that all the bedroom doors are open and no roommates to be found. Must be them. They're messing with me. I arrive at my front door and look through the peephole and see a young woman standing on the other side. She appeared to be homeless, but was actually kind of cute. She had a really baggy sweatshirt on, with jeans and a beanie. Might I remind you that this is Arizona in the dead of summer. It had to be at least 95 degrees at this time, so her attire was odd. She was acting frantic, almost like she was being chased. I was going to open the door to make sure she was okay, but then she started laughing. It was a very disturbing kind of laugh, which stopped me dead on my tracks. "I have to pee. Please let me in." I just stood behind the door in silence, watching her through the peephole. I wasn't scared at this moment, just annoyed and about to yell at her to get the hell out of here. Then all of a sudden, she just turns around and skipped down my driveway like a child. I just thought to myself this girl was whacked out on drugs or something. I go back to bed, and 30 minutes later, I was just about to fall back asleep when the knocking starts again. Now I'm furious, about to get up and run back to my front door to give this woman a piece of my mind. But this time, when I looked through the hole, it was a man. He was dressed in practically the same outfit the woman had been wearing. He was scrawny looking, not physically intimidating by any means, but he just looked whacked out, like she did. I then see the girl behind the man, jumping up and down and laughing. The guy gets right up to the peephole. "Yo, you better let us in. My girl has to pee." Not gonna lie, I'm a bit freaked out now. I've seen a lot of situations like this in horror films. So I just back away from the door, go to the kitchen and grab a knife. Then I go back to my room and hide in my closet. I figured if they were going to break in, at least they wouldn't see me at first in the closet, and I could launch a counterattack. 2 hours pass, and there's no more noises, and I fall asleep in my closet with the knife in my hand. It was then that I heard a tapping on my bedroom window. My bedroom is on the first floor and is accessible from the backyard. The lights are off, so I creep over to the window and slowly push aside one of the blinds. It was the woman peering into my bedroom, but not looking directly at me. And she was just subtly tapping the window. Off in the distance, I see the guy, butt-ass naked, doing cannonballs in my pool. I instinctively start yelling, "Hey, get the hell out of my pool!" This brings the girl's attention straight to me. We made eye contact and were inches away from each other. She had the scariest smile I've ever seen, and then she starts giggling. That freaked me the hell out. I call the cops right away and tell them some crazy drugged up wackos are in my backyard and that I'm in fear for my life. I went into my bathroom and locked the door, just waiting for the "Here's Johnny" moment. The dispatcher calls back and informs me that the cops were there, but no one was outside the house. They must have took off down the alley when they saw the cops approaching. The next day, I see the neighborhood watch flyers all over, informing us that over the past 3 nights, 6 homes have been broken into, 4 dogs have been brutally attacked, and to keep an eye out for any strange people in the neighborhood. Hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. But thankfully, I never saw or heard from those wackos since. Since that night, I've installed an alarm system, bought a handgun, and now I sleep great. But the look on that woman's face still haunts my dreams. So this happened quite a few years ago. I was probably 12 or 13 at the time, and I was staying at a hotel with my parents, along with my aunt, uncle, and cousin, who's a year older than me. One night our parents decided to go get coffee together at a cafe in the lobby of the hotel. Now it's important to note that it's one of those hotels that span across several buildings. The cafe my parents went to was several buildings away from the one that we were staying in, but that wasn't a problem for my cousin and I, seeing as the pool was just downstairs. At around 8 o'clock, we texted our parents, put on our bathing suits, and went downstairs to the pool. Things were fine at first. We swam around, and my cousin and I caught up on things that had happened in our schools, the relationships we had been in, etc. Eventually, we ended up just quietly floating on our backs, watching the stars. Without even looking over at my cousin, I said something to the effect of,
"Wow, it's really nice out, huh?"
I said it in a kind of weird voice, hoping I would get a laugh out of her. That's when I heard a guy chuckle. I sat up in the water really fast, my face quickly growing red. I didn't realize that I had floated away from my cousin and was now next to some random guy. He was probably in his early 20s, and he offered me a creepy smile. At 13, I was very shy, so I gave a nervous laugh and hightailed it back over to my cousin, who promptly bursted into laughter and started making fun of me, jokingly demanding to know if he was cute and if he had really laughed at the dumb voice I made. I was too embarrassed to find the situation funny and stayed really close to her, not daring to glance back down to the other side of the pool, where he was now sitting on the edge. My cousin, whose name is Lizzie, just moved on, chatting about random things as we waited in the pool. She got progressively quieter, though, eventually playfully splashing me to get my attention. "Your new boyfriend is still watching us," she noted. And even though she was still grinning, there was something uneasy in her voice. I glanced over, and sure enough, he was still sitting on the edge of the pool, watching us. She splashed me again. "Don't pay him any attention. You may not know much about guys, but I do. And the trick is to just ignore them." She wasn't exactly wrong. I was homeschooled, and I never really talked to guys who were older than me. In my eyes, she was an expert in this subject, full of worldly wisdom. I watched her face, mimicking her. "Maybe we should call one of our moms," I said, as she shook her head. "No, let's just go back to the hotel room. I don't want to freak my mom out." That seemed like a good idea to the both of us. Her mom was kind of terrifying when she was mad. "We can text her when we get up there." I nodded, moving and pushing myself out of the pool, grabbing our towels and shoes. She made some joke about what was going on, but I didn't hear it. The guy was now standing up, though he seemed to be pretty casual about getting his own things. When I looked back at her, her expression confirmed that she had seen it, but she just kept putting on her shoes, and I followed suit. Walking close behind her, we approached the stairs and began to ascend them. Both of us were a bit nervous, but still holding out hope that this was just a coincidence, until we heard footsteps behind us. A brief glance revealed the guy was just a flight behind us, meeting my gaze with a creepy grin. He didn't seem drunk or high, at least from my sheltered perspective. "Lizzie?" I said quietly, trying to alert her that he was close. "I know. Let's go to the wrong floor. We can loop back around and just go to our rooms, and then we'll call my mom from there." She was moving up the stairs much faster now. I could see the look of anxiety on her face. As an avid reader of mystery novels, it seemed like the best possible choice. So we got off 2 floors early, speed walking down the hallway and around the corner. Just as we were out of sight, Lizzie grabbed my hand, taking off into a run, nearly jerking me off my feet. Before that moment, I had never been legitimately scared of something in my life, but fear is infectious. We heard the echo of footsteps behind us on the same floor we chose to loop around on. I squeezed her hand, keeping up pace with her. We whipped around the next corner, and then the next, until we found the stairwell again, taking them 2 at a time back to our floor. A high-pitched squeal escaped from Lizzie, who at this point was dragging me along. I was scared out of my wits, practically paralyzed, tripping up the stairs, then down the hall of our floor. She jammed the key into our room's door and pushed me inside, immediately slamming it shut and drawing the blinds as soon as we were inside. She then burst into tears as soon as the door was closed. She was crying more from adrenaline than anything, but after she calmed down, she wasted no time picking up the phone and trying to call her mom, who didn't pick up. We then tried my mom, who didn't answer her phone either. It felt like we must have waited for hours sitting on the bed and shivering from wearing our still wet bathing suits. We did eventually calm down, though we were offering each other rationalizations about what happened. Maybe he hadn't been trying to follow us. Perhaps we had just picked to get off on this guy's floor. When you're scared, it's honestly pretty easy to believe everything was just all one big coincidence. Once we were completely calmed down, we decided to do a very dumb thing. Go out to the car to get Lizzie's activity bag, full of snacks and her Game Boy. It seemed like a bright idea at the time, since we both believed that everything had just been one big misunderstanding, and we were both kind of starving at this point. Wrapped up in towels, she grabbed her mom's keys and her cell phone, and we came up with a plan at the hotel room door. Just to be safe, if we saw the pool creeper again, we would lock ourselves in the car, and we'll start calling every number we can think of. And if he appears while we're walking back, we make a break straight to the lobby and find our parents. It seemed pretty foolproof at the time. Now, looking back, this is the kind of dumb plan that you see play out in horror films. Nothing happened until we got to the parking lot in front of our building. We then heard a voice calling to us from down the hall. "Hey, where do you two think you're going, cuties?" We look back and see the pool creep standing at the end of the hall. Lizzie let out some sort of unearthly screech and grabbed my hand, dragging me along before I could get a better look. She yanked open the car door and dove inside as I tumbled in after her, locking the car door as soon as we were both inside. As soon as she caught her breath, she untangled herself from me and pulled herself into the back of the minivan, into the furthest row, and motioned for me to do the same, so I hunkered down with her between the seats. It was then we heard tapping. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound of the tapping was unmistakable. Lizzie pulled me tight, not moving, like he wouldn't be able to see us if we just held still. I don't know how long we stayed there, frozen in terror, and I wasn't sure what was worse, the darkness of keeping my eyes closed, or what I would see if I opened them. And just like that, he stopped. Neither of us moved for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I began crying, scared to death, Lizzie just being deathly still, until she began pushing me to sit up. I realized what she was doing a moment later, when I heard her dialing on the phone, and the sound of each of our parents' voicemail greetings. She didn't call 911. Looking back now, we really should have, but at the time, I thought 911 was a number reserved for house fires or murders, not guys in their 20s following little girls to the car. I know, stupid. He was nowhere to be seen. We eventually ran out of the car and back to the hotel, falling into a sobbing heap once again. When our parents came back, they regretted not having their cell phones on and comforted us, eventually convincing us that, though the guy was creepy, we hadn't been in any real danger. I think they thought that was the truth, and honestly at the time, that was what we wanted to believe. Lizzie and I saw him again a few times after that, mostly at night when he sat by the pool, offering us a creepy grin every time we passed, but we were always with our parents until we left the hotel. When he saw us leaving with our parents, he offered us this forlorn little wave that no one but me saw. He then mouthed something to me, and what I think he said was, "See you later, cutie." I didn't tell my parents. It didn't seem worth it to me. It wasn't until years later that I now realize how creepy this guy truly was. I find it hard to believe that he was harmless, and just thought it was funny to follow two preteen girls around a hotel. Either way, I'm glad I never encountered him again. This happened in September of 2022, and at the time I lived in Wisconsin. I was also a sophomore in high school. I met a 17-year-old named Austin at my summer job. He used to attend the same high school as me, but had been expelled for plagiarism. That's what he told me, and I didn't question it. You can be thrown out of a university for plagiarizing someone else's work, but high school would put you into detention at worst, leading me to believe that he was kicked out for a different reason. We became friendly, and he would pick me up and drop me off during the summer whenever we had work, because I didn't have a driver's license at the time. I also want to point out that it was pretty obvious that he had a crush on me, but I didn't feel the same way about him. To clarify, he insisted on giving me a ride, and I even offered to give him money to cover gas. I was not leading him on in any way. Fast forward to the second or third week of school. Austin and I were driving home from a party that a mutual friend from school was throwing. Again, I needed a ride. When Austin pulled up to my house to drop me off, he finally popped the question. "Hey, listen, I think you and I should go out sometime." I'm sorry, Austin. I just don't have those kind of feelings for you. I would prefer if we stayed friends." I could tell that my response really upset him. Looking back, I can see how he may have gotten the wrong idea. Please try not to judge me too harshly. The only excuse I have was that I was only a teenager back then. We waved goodbye to each other, and I went inside my house, took off my shoes, changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and was ready to call it a night. Before I fell asleep, I got a text from a friend. What I read on screen is something I'll never forget. It was a paragraph-long message about how Austin had been secretly taking photos of me while I was sleeping in my bed, through my window. While that revelation was still sinking in, several photos of me sleeping came through. Apparently, Austin had been bragging about it at the party, and even showed off his collection, which found their way back to me. When you're hit with news like that, you feel cold. I knew that Austin had a thing for me, but I didn't think it would ever be something this twisted. On top of that, I was literally in the exact spot of where the photos were taken. The first thing I did was check my window and close my blinds. I then immediately sent him a text in all caps. "Never contact me again." He seemed to know right away why I said that to him, and quickly began to apologize and started playing the victim card. I felt like screaming after reading his pathetic texts, and then told him, "Lose my number and never speak to me again." Then I blocked him. I wasn't feeling tired anymore, and I got up to take some melatonin so I could fall asleep. I don't know how long I was out for, but I woke up to the sound of my window shattering. I sat up in bed to see a dark figure stepping through. I quickly got out of bed and ran toward the door. The figure moved to catch me, but slipped on a piece of broken glass and fell to the floor. When I looked back, I could see that the intruder was in fact Austin, and that he also had a knife in his hand. I started to scream hysterically. My dad quickly came out into the hallway, asking me what the hell was going on. All I could do was point to my bedroom door. When he rushed inside, Austin was gone. After I told my father who it was, he immediately called the police, and they arrived 10 minutes later, along with the paramedics. I didn't know it at first, but when I rushed out of my bedroom, My feet were cut on the broken glass. I had lost a lot of blood and was now feeling dizzy. After I told the police my side of the story, the paramedics ended up taking me to the hospital, where I stayed overnight. It took the cops a while to track down Austin, but they eventually arrested him. During his sentencing, he addressed the court and admitted that he didn't know why he did it, and also expressed that he was in love with me. Austin was convicted of multiple felony charges. The prosecutor was able to uncover more evidence that proved he intended to kill me, so the final verdict was breaking and entering and attempted first-degree murder. A year later, he successfully appealed the murder charge. I don't know all the details, but his mental health and lack of criminal record before that night played a major factor. Austin is currently serving a 16-year prison sentence. Although justice has been served, I still get very skittish whenever I meet new people, especially men. I know I sound crazy, but I still have a lot of PTSD over what happened that night. I hope Austin goes to hell for what he did. This story happened back in 2013. I live in Long Island, New York. One day in August, I went to Mastic Beach, which wasn't my first choice, but the next closest beach was a 35-minute drive away, and I only had my learner's permit at the time and wasn't supposed to be driving anywhere alone. But Mastic Beach was only 5 minutes away from my house. Once I got there, I saw that there was no other car in sight, which should have been my cue to leave. Not really a good idea to be the only car parked in the lot, but I really wanted to get out that day, so I decided to risk it. I took my stuff out of the car, found a spot in the sand, and made my way over to the water. I thought about swimming, but once I saw that the water was all murky and algae-ridden, I changed my mind and went back to my chair and dried myself off with a towel. I wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon because it was such a nice day out and there was no one else around. I decided that I would take a stroll along the shore. About 10 minutes later, I smelled something foul in the air. At first, I thought it might have been some trash lying around or a dead fish may have washed up on shore. But as I continued to walk forward, the stench kept getting stronger and stronger. I didn't see anything, but it was like I was drawing closer to the source. I then felt my foot hit something hard, almost causing me to fall over. I looked down, and what I saw was something straight out of a horror film. It was the lifeless head of a woman, with her mouth open and her eyes glazed over, making her look like a zombie. When I saw this, I yelped like a small dog and ran back to my chair. Once I got back, I remember vomiting. I've seen horror films before, but seeing the real deal is a whole other level. Once I collected myself, I got my phone out and called the police. The dispatcher told me to stay put and that the police would be there shortly. After I gave my statement, the officers thanked me and told me that they would call me if they had any more questions. I would say 3 weeks passed before I saw a news report that the dead woman had finally been identified. Her name was Diane Ross, and she was 63 years old. It was also revealed that the cause of her death was murder. I was in shock. As of the writing of this story, the police still have no idea who the killer is. A long time ago, my job had an office near the Canadian border in Washington State. I often had to travel up there to help train staff. Being a bachelor in my late 20s and liked getting away for a few days, I was always up to making some extra cash by volunteering to go whenever help was needed up there. I would usually fly up there, but there were a few occasions where I would have to bring some equipment with me and would drive. This one particular time was about 17 years ago. We had bought a bunch of equipment wholesale and would have to be delivered, along with some other odds and ends to our office in upstate Washington. Of course, everyone knew that I would volunteer for the drive. I would be driving a box truck up there and would have to fly back. Prior to this, I would always drive a company car or an SUV, but I wasn't too worried. The box truck wasn't that big. I always preferred to start my journey toward the end of the day because I'm one of those people who like driving at night. For the majority of my drive, it was uneventful. I only stopped at gas stations and the occasional rest stop whenever nature called. At some point near the California-Oregon border is when things started to get strange. It was approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. I had to stop at a rest area. It was probably the last one on the California side. In the far distance, I do remember seeing some truckers parked. But basically, the rest of the parking lot was empty. Now at this point, I wasn't really thinking anything was creepy or out of the ordinary. I get out of my truck and go to the restroom to take care of business. I took my time because I wanted to stretch my legs a bit. Once I made my exit and began walking back over to my truck, I noticed that there's a vehicle parked next to mine. This entire parking lot was open, and this person pulls up right next to me. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off and jumped back into the truck to continue my journey. About 10 or 12 miles down the freeway, my truck begins to act funny. The interior lights begin flickering. A little while later, all the lights in the vehicle go out. The interior lights, the tail lights, and the headlights. At this point, it's about 2 a.m., and I'm driving through a forested area in southern Oregon. I was more angry than scared at that point, driving 60 miles an hour in the middle of what seemed to be like a scene out of Tales from the Dark Side. I pound my fist on the dashboard and scream at the truck. Almost instantly, everything came back on. At the next rest stop, I decided to pull over again. All the adrenaline made me had to take another piss. I jumped out of my truck and went to the restroom, although this time I didn't take as long inside. When I came back out, I remember thinking that I should stay there until dawn. As I approach my truck again, I see an older guy, somewhat heavy-set, gray hair. He was standing next to my truck. I didn't see a vehicle near mine, but I just assumed that he was out stretching his legs. As I get closer, he starts up a conversation, saying something about the weather. A very light snow was falling, but not the kind of stuff that stays on the ground. I wasn't really paying much attention to him, because my first impression was he was just a lonely old guy who wanted to chat, and I really wasn't in the mood. He then said something that made my hairs stand up. As he was looking at my truck, he says, "Are you having some mechanical problems?" I stopped in my tracks, and I felt all the blood rushing to my head. I just said, no, it's working fine. I just stopped here to use the restroom." "Oh, well, I don't live too far from here. You're more than welcome to join me for a hot cup of coffee. Or maybe you want to rest on the couch for a while." This guy had no idea who I was, and he was inviting me into his home? This kinda gave me the creeps, but I kept it to myself. So I basically ended the conversation with, "No thanks, I better get back on the road before the snow gets worse." As I was driving away, I see that he's walking behind the restrooms, so I think to myself, what the heck was that all about? My mind is racing and retracing my last few stops. How did this guy know that I was having mechanical problems with my truck? I suddenly thought back to the rest stop in California and remembering that car that was parked next to me. Could he have done something to the wiring of my truck while I was in the restroom? A few more miles down the road, I wasn't having any new problems with my lights, but I did have to stop at a gas station to fill up. In the state of Oregon, they don't let you pump your own gas, so while I was waiting for the attendant, I decided to go in and grab a drink. As I was waiting for my fueling, I walk around my truck and look for any signs of tampering, and then noticed up near the front fender of the truck, I could see some smears that I wasn't really sure of. I just told myself, "You're just freaking yourself out." As soon as the attendant filled up my tank, I jumped back into the truck, and just as I was pulling out of the gas station, I see a car parked in the corner of the gas station's parking lot. Someone was inside, staring at me. I tell myself that I'm just being paranoid, but this car looked a lot like the one that I had seen in California. Was that old man following me? Was he waiting for the right time and place to sabotage my vehicle? As I continued driving, the snow became a bit more concerning. I didn't grow up in an area that had heavy snowfall, but I did have a little bit of experience driving in the snow, but not enough to know when things became too hazardous. I looked out my rearview mirror and see a pair of headlights trailing behind me, which was odd because most drivers just passed me up, but this person was tailing me. I was already going well under the speed limit and I slowed down a bit more, but still, the driver was not passing me. I was approaching Portland, Oregon. It was still dark out and the snow was still lightly falling. I decided that I would pull over again, and maybe the car that was behind me would pass. I take the next exit, and in front of me is another gas station with a patrol car parked out front. I immediately pulled up next to the cruiser and got out. There was a lady police officer there, and I start making a conversation with her about the snow and the expected conditions. I was thinking about telling her about the car behind me, but suddenly I felt kinda silly about it. What was I going to say? "Hey officer, I think I'm being followed by an old man who may or may not have done something to my truck." She was very nice, and she asked me where I was going and where I came from. I kept looking around to see if I could spot the car, but it was nowhere in sight. She suggested that I stop for the night and starts telling me about the dangers of driving without proper sleep, and tells me that if I go down the road a couple blocks, there was a motel behind a gas station. I decided that she was right. The stress of this entire situation was exhausting. Hopefully by the time I get back out on the road, the snow would be gone and I would be more rested. As I pulled up to the motel, I decided to park my truck behind the building so it wouldn't be seen from the road. I go to my hotel room as quickly as I could and lock the door. Honestly, I didn't get much rest. I stayed up and watched TV and nodded off here and there, jumping at every noise I heard outside. My mind kept racing back, recalling all the events from before the California border, up to my conversation with the police officer. Maybe he saw me talking to the cop and decided to back off. Maybe he was waiting for me to pull over at another rest stop to carry out whatever his plan was. Why would a stranger invite another stranger into his house in the middle of the night at a rest stop? And why did he ask if I was having problems with my truck? This all felt too strange to just be a coincidence. Finally, at around 7 a.m., I decided that enough was enough. I got up, had myself a big breakfast before checking out of the hotel, and continued on my trip to the office. Thankfully, nothing else strange happened, but I always wondered about that night. Call me paranoid, but something deep down tells me that I interrupted that old man from doing something else to my truck at the rest stop in Oregon. Maybe he was part of a robbery plot for whatever was in the back of my truck. I guess I'll never know. I just feel like I avoided something terrible happening to me. This story is more of an urbex experience. However, it did happen during a sleepover. It took place in Alton, which is a small countryside town in England. The town doesn't really have much to offer for young people growing up there, and for that reason, it encouraged many rebellious kids like myself to find mischievous things to do in our spare time, often without our parents' knowledge. I'm not an easily scared individual, but this experience shook me up for a whole month. I remember it as clear as glass. It was a Friday. My friend, who I will call Jack, asked me in math class if I wanted to do a sleepover at his place for the weekend. I was hesitant at first because I wasn't really a fan of sleepovers, but then he persuaded me by mentioning that there was this abandoned hospital to explore in the woods. I jumped at the idea because I was really into all things scary and had heard about this same abandoned hospital in a Mr. Nightmare video. The thought had crossed my mind to go explore it since I lived in the same town, and this would present the perfect opportunity. Of course, I said yes, and then Jack told me to be at his place at noon on Saturday. I got home after a tiring day and did some further research about this abandoned hospital online. It was called the Robertson House. After scrolling for a few seconds, I came across more YouTube videos of creators exploring the hospital, which I was surprised to see. One of the videos began giving an explanation of how this place was used to treat British soldiers who had returned from the South African Boer War. It was then reopened in 1908 and was used as a treatment center for children who suffered from tuberculosis, but for whatever reason it got shut down and was sold off in 2001. Since then, there have been stories circling the internet of paranormal activity happening within the building, from the voices of children being heard down the hallways to loud taps and bangs on the walls. I was always skeptical of the paranormal, so I didn't read too much into it. The next day, I made it to Jack's house in the afternoon, and we quickly ate dinner, barely able to contain our excitement. When we left, we told Jack's mom that we were only going to the town center and wouldn't be gone for more than a couple of hours. His mother nodded, and we set off toward the hospital. After 20 minutes, we got to the forest that supposedly led up to the hospital's estate. It was a quiet, isolated area. As the twigs snapped beneath our feet, we both picked up on just how silent it suddenly became out here. Despite being with a friend, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that had hit my stomach since entering these woods. I was hoping that at any second I would hear the sound of birds, or leaves rustling, or the wind blowing through the trees. But that wish never came true. It was like all life ceased to exist in this area. I was almost regretting my decision to come here. However, I carried on, staying on high alert until we finally came across the towering bricks that I had seen in the YouTube videos. Tall grass and weeds covered the bottom half of the building, and every window was boarded up with graffiti splashed all over them. Except for one that stood out. It was like being in a scene in the show, The Haunting of Hill House. Jack strolled ahead of me because he could see that I was losing my confidence. He told me, "The entrance is this way," and pointed toward the one window that hadn't been boarded up. Jack climbed inside first, being careful not to cut himself, and then I followed. We both stood by the window preparing our phone flashlights before slowly stepping into the dark hallway. I noticed more graffiti littering the walls, as well as spider eggs hanging from the doorways, which Jack pointed out to me and jokingly said, "You do not want to crack one of these open." I was too fearful to laugh in the moment. We both noticed that there was a door in the hallway that was halfway open. I pointed my flashlight to the aperture, and that's when Jack dared me to walk in there without my phone, to which I strongly declined. I said to him that if anyone was going to go in there alone, it would be him. He agreed to do it, but not without calling me a massive coward for refusing. I watched nervously as he approached the door, pushed it open, and then turned his phone light off. I then saw his figure slowly disappear into the room, and then an eerie silence followed. I waited outside clutching my phone, thinking about calling it a night, when suddenly I hear Jack yell, "What the fuck?" I heard genuine fear in his voice, so I knew he wasn't joking around. I swiftly rushed in and saw Jack in the middle of the room, looking down at his feet with his back to me. I asked him what was wrong, and when he turned to look at me, I could see a look of pure fear in his eyes. He signaled to me what he was staring at, and when I saw myself, my blood ran cold. Inches away from Jack's feet was a pile of bird carcasses stacked on top of each other. Some were old and decomposed, while others looked fresh. We heard what sounded like hooves crashing down above our heads. Jack and I looked at each other, confirming to me that we were both hearing the same thing. "Yo, fuck this," I said, and booked it toward the exit, As I walked past the staircase, Jack yelled out, "Hey, I still want to see what's upstairs." "Have you lost your mind? I know you heard those footsteps too. There could be a squatter roaming around up there." He ignored me, and without hesitation, he shouted from the bottom of the staircase, "Hey, is anyone up there? We mean you no harm." An uncomfortable vibe followed. He then took his first step. The stairs creaked loudly as he did. My anxiety was stirring with each step he took. Even though I wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of there, I didn't want him to go alone. I approached the bottom step, but as I got there, Jack said, "Don't. You're not going up there alone. The stairs will collapse if you take another step. Just stay here." Fine. This is a really stupid idea. I'm gonna wait for you outside." He nodded to me, then disappeared out of sight. And then I made my way to the window that we entered through and carefully hoisted myself out of the building. I waited for a good minute, wondering if I had made the right choice to leave Jack in there. Suddenly, I heard the sound of sprinting, getting louder and louder, coming from inside the building. That's when I saw Jack through the window, running toward me. He then jumped out, faster than a cheetah. Before I could even ask any questions, he told me to run and to not stop. I followed after him, running faster than I ever had before, with adrenaline pumping through my veins. After what felt like a half an hour, we made it to the town's center and stopped to catch our breath. Once I regained my composure, I asked him what the hell happened in there. Jack told me that after he got to the top of the stairs, he saw a room directly in front of him and could see small glimmers of light at the bottom of the door. He then put two and two together and determined that this was the area where we had heard the footsteps coming from. He continued the story and said that when he opened the door, he pointed his phone's light into the room and saw a huge pentagram painted on the floor with candles surrounding it. When he backed out of the room and into the hallway, he then saw several robed figures standing at the end of the hallway, looking at him. That's when he decided that he had enough excitement for one night, and it was time to leave. We chose to not speak a word about this to anyone. To this day, this experience still sends chills down my spine. Who were those people in the hospital with us? Was it some kind of cult that lives out in those woods? Quite frankly, I don't need to know that badly. I stay far away from those woods now, and I advise anyone to never allow their curiosity to get the better of them in situations like this. There are some things that are better left in the forest. When I was around 10 years old, I had been invited for the first time to a sleepover at my friend's house. We'll call her Abby. She lives pretty far away from me, so whenever we hung out, it always felt like a special occasion. I had just started becoming brave enough to sleep at other people's houses, and since Abby was one of my oldest friends, this would be a trial run of sorts. Here's a little background about Abby's family. She is the youngest of 4. Her oldest brother, who is about 10 years older than us, has pretty severe autism and continues to live full-time with Abby's parents. He was always a bit of a wild card, and as a 10-year-old girl, I always felt a little anxious around him. Anyways, there were 3 of us girls at the slumber party. We decided to sleep on the main floor of her house so we could stay up late watching movies. I chose to sleep on a couch that was perpendicular to a wall of windows that overlooked the backyard. The other girls were sharing a mattress on the floor. We threw on a DVD, but we all eventually fell asleep during the movie. Sleeping away from home has never been easy for me. I wake up frequently, and sometimes can't even fall asleep to begin with. This night was one of those times. After about 2 hours, something stirred me back to consciousness. When I came to, I was bombarded by the bright glow of the TV. After my eyes adjusted, I noticed something outside that hadn't been there before. There was someone sitting in one of the deck chairs and had positioned it to face directly toward where the three of us were sleeping. He hadn't noticed that I was awake, but seeing him made my heart race. I stayed totally still, watching him. It was dark, but I could still tell that he was studying us and smirking. Terrified, I watched him for a few more minutes before turning myself into the couch cushion and closing my eyes. Some time passed, until I finally mustered up the courage to look again. He was gone. To this day, I have no idea who it was that had gotten into Abby's backyard and sat on her deck and watched us in the middle of the night, but the image of him sitting there, grinning, still haunts me. I thought it may have been her brother, but from what I could see, this man had dark hair and dark eyes. Abby's brother has blonde hair and blue eyes. They looked nothing alike. Luckily, we all made it to the next morning unharmed, but this was the last time I ever spent the night at Abby's house. I was 11 years old when this occurred. It was a weekend, and I was supposed to spend it at my friend's house. For 11-year-old me, this was very exciting. Having been slammed with schoolwork the entire week, I was to spend what I believed to be Friday night sleeping over, and the entirety of Saturday, and would return home that evening. What made it even better was the fact that her parents had an event they could not avoid, and trusted us to stay in their 2-story house for the 6 hours they would be gone for. Back then, the idea of spending the whole night alone with my friend was great. No interference, and a whole 6 hours of games and movies on their huge TV. But it turns out, my friend had other ideas. I arrived at her house just short of 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and her parents had waited for me to arrive. Before telling us about the emergency contacts, dinner, and such, they also reminded us to make sure their 4-year-old Labrador was inside by a certain time, as it was supposed to rain later on, and his kennel had a few loose panels which leaked when it rained. After they left, we watched a few shows, had dinner, and were chilling in her living room playing cards. That's when Sid, my friend, had the ingenious idea of exploring a fenced-in plot of land that was just down the street. The area was overgrown with plants and weeds. We got the dog inside, grabbed the keys, and left the house to make the short 10-minute trip. It would have been around 10 p.m. by this point. In retrospect, this is where we still had a chance to avoid this particular encounter, but being the curious and daring 11-year-olds we were, we ventured out anyways. Rather uneventfully, we arrived and climbed over the fence. Luckily for us, the fencing was run down enough in certain places for us to make it through pretty easily. Once inside, Sid suggested that we sit a few meters away from each other for as long as we could, until one of us was too scared to continue. Remember, we were both 11. This was our idea of fun. We faced each other and walked backwards until there was just enough light to see the general silhouette of the other. After what seemed to be a good 10 minutes, I saw Sid rise up and start walking toward me. She seemed to be walking rather fast as well, jumping over rocks and debris at a daring pace, even getting cut by some thorns in the process. She came up to me, and just as I was about to laugh at her and call her out for being scared, she told me to get up because she had to go feed Shaggy, the Labrador. I remember being very confused because her parents had already filled his bowl with food before they left, but I saw the look on her face. I had never seen her this pale before. It looked like she had just seen a ghost. So without asking any questions, I said okay, and we made our way back over the fence, albeit in a very tense and quick manner. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt Sid grab my arm, and we began sprinting down the street. To put things into perspective, I had a bruise where she grabbed me for the next 2 weeks. We ran like hell, arriving at her house and went through the metal gate in her front yard. She handed me the house key and told me to unlock the front door while she deadbolted the gate's various locks. It was at this point I was starting to panic. But we got into the house, where Sid then proceeded to run around, locking and closing all the windows and doors, as well as pulling the curtains shut. I was very confused as to why she was doing all this, and so was Shaggy, who just stood there watching her. After about 10 minutes, she came back into the living room. With a very intense expression, she explained to me that the reason that she had done all this was because while we were sitting apart back at the lot, she happened to glance a few meters to my right and saw a figure crouching behind some bushes. She thought she was imagining it at first, until it crept closer to where I was sitting. They seemed to be unaware that she was watching them. She didn't want to startle me or let the person know that she had seen them, so she made up the story about having to feed her dog so we could get out of there without alerting the figure who was still crouching there. After hearing this, I was quite shaken, and we hugged for a few minutes, deciding not to tell our parents, as they had very much warned us not to go out, and we didn't want this to be the last sleepover we had together. So we thought it was best to keep this to ourselves. We peeked out of the window into the streets, which seemed to be empty as far as we could see. We put this event behind us and decided to continue having a fun sleepover. I would love to say that this is where things ended, but what happens next has stuck with me to this day, and I still get scared just thinking about it. To give you an idea of the layout of her house, a concrete wall surrounded the home. It had one entrance in the front where the metal gate was. The house itself had 3 potential entry points. The obvious 2 are the front and back door. The third was an exterior basement entrance. Those of you who live up north will know what I'm talking about. It looks like a cellar on the side of the house. It had a metal door with an outside lock. So an hour or so after the incident, we were upstairs in Sid's bedroom playing games on her computer when we heard the dog barking downstairs. Shaggy was growling at something. Keep in mind that her dog was mostly friendly. He rarely ever growled or barked aggressively. Sid went to go check on him. When she returned a short time later, she informed me that the dog was standing near the front door, growling. We were very confused. This was unusual for him to do. We thought maybe a stray dog or cat might have wandered onto the front porch or something, so we decided to go to the balcony that was attached to her room, which overlooked the front yard and out into the street. Instead of seeing what we assumed to be a stray animal, we looked down to see someone standing in the front lawn. In the very limited light we had, we could make out heavy layers of clothing and a head full of hair that looked very matted. Shaggy had joined us on the balcony and was wanting to be let outside. We crouched, and just as we were about to discuss what we should do, we heard what sounded like the front door rattling, as if someone was trying to open it. We crept back downstairs, only to realize that the person was now at one of the windows next to the door and was trying to open it. The realization hit that they were trying to find a way inside by going around the perimeter. Just as we were about to retreat back upstairs, my friend grabbed me again, and in a hushed tone, she told me that she had forgotten to lock the basement door. We both looked at each other. If the intruder managed to get inside the basement, there would only be a flimsy lock on the inner basement door, separating us from him. At this point, we heard more windows being shook behind the house. We were lucky that he had chosen the opposite side of the house from where the exterior basement door was located, but he would eventually reach it. Sid told me to wait in the hallway with Shaggy while she went outside to lock the exterior basement door. She informed me that if she was caught, I was to let the dog loose. We were both terrified, and since we didn't have time to think about it, I stood guard while she left through the front door and ran around to the other side of the house. I could still hear the windows being shaken as the intruder was still looking for an opening. I then heard Sid fumbling with a lock before finally managing to turn the deadbolt. She then quickly ran back inside. Trust me, those few seconds were nerve-wracking. We then shut the front door and locked it, and just as we did, we heard the exterior door rattle harshly. If she had not gone out to lock it when she did, the intruder would have found his way inside. While he tried opening all the other windows, we made our way back upstairs to the balcony. When we looked down, we saw him once again, standing in the front lawn. However, this time, we could see his head was tilted back. It appeared that he was looking right at us. However, we knew that it was too dark for him to be able to spot us. We had turned off all the lights in the bedroom beforehand. He then started laughing. He then got down on all fours and crawled around the front lawn of the house, all the while still laughing like a lunatic. In retrospect, this was a very disturbing individual. We should have absolutely called the police, but being the terrified 11-year-olds we were, we still didn't want to get into trouble. We had led this crazy person back here by breaking the rules. He continued crawling around for nearly half an hour. He then stood up, then made his way over to Shaggy's kennel in the corner. He used it to hoist himself over the wall and jumped down on the other side. We were still standing on the balcony, waiting and listening to see if he would return. But fortunately, we had seen the last of him that night. At around 2 a.m, her parents finally returned. The next day, they were very confused as to why all the doors and windows were closed and why there was mud on the front doorknob. We told them that we were playing hide and seek and we wanted the house to be as dark as possible. We should have told them the truth. Although we were scared, we didn't understand just how dangerous this situation was. God only knows what that man would have done to us if he had managed to get inside.